Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight, we step into the extraordinary life of Napoleon Bonaparte. Few figures in history rose so quickly or left so much argument behind. He began as a young officer from a small island, yet he became the man every ruler in Europe had to reckon with. His story is not simple admiration. It is a study of ambition at its most powerful. Napoleon could inspire devotion in exhausted soldiers. He could reshape a nation with law. He could also drive entire countries into years of fear. That tension is what makes him so fascinating. He was a reformer who became an emperor. He was a genius who made enormous mistakes. He was defeated, yet never truly disappeared. Tonight, we will follow the human being behind the legend. We will see how power changed him. We will notice how history still feels his presence. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Allow your breathing to slow. And join me as we explore the remarkable world of Napoleon together. Let's begin. Napoleon turned a shattered revolution into an empire that terrified Europe. When he rose to power, France was not a calm nation waiting for a ruler. It had passed through revolution, executions, foreign war, financial strain, and political exhaustion. Many people wanted order so badly that they were willing to accept a soldier who promised stability. Napoleon understood that mood with remarkable precision. He did not present himself as a return to the old kings. He presented himself as the man who could protect the revolution from chaos. That was the brilliance of his rise. He borrowed the language of liberty while building a system centered on his own authority. Courts, schools, roads, armies, and ministries began to move around him. Outside France, monarchs watched with alarm because this was not an ordinary conqueror. He carried new laws, new administrations, and new ideas behind his armies. Europe was not only facing battlefield defeat, it was facing a new political force, but could remake society itself. He crowned himself emperor while the Pope watched in silence. The ceremony in Notre Dame was designed to feel ancient and shocking at the same time. Napoleon wanted the sacred weight of monarchy, but he also wanted everyone to understand that his power did not come from the church alone. Pope Pius VII had traveled to Paris for the coronation, which was already a powerful symbol. Then came the moment that people remembered most. Rather than simply receive the crown, Napoleon took it into his own hands. The gesture was carefully staged. It told France that he was not a puppet of Rome. It told Europe that a new kind of ruler had arrived. He then crowned Josephine, making the scene even more personal and theatrical. Every detail mattered, from the robes to the music, to the paintings that would later preserve the image. The event was not just a coronation. It was political theater on a grand scale, and Napoleon knew exactly what message it sent. His armies marched faster than enemies believed humanly possible. Speed was one of Napoleon's greatest weapons, and it often mattered as much as cannon fire. Many commanders moved as if war were a slow puzzle. Napoleon treated it as a race of nerves. His troops could cover long distances with astonishing urgency because they were organized to live off supply systems that moved quickly or from resources found along the route. This was exhausting for the soldiers, but it gave him a deadly advantage. He could appear where opponents least expected him. He could split enemy forces before they joined together. He could force a battle before his rivals had finished planning. the psychological effect was enormous. Reports would arrive that he was far away. Then suddenly he would be almost upon them. Opposing generals often found themselves reacting rather than deciding. In an age before radios or railways, this ability made his army feel almost unnatural. He turned movement itself into a form of shock. Napoleon sold Louisiana and changed America's future almost overnight. The decision began with a French dream that was already slipping away. Napoleon had imagined rebuilding a vast Western empire across the Atlantic, but events made that vision difficult to hold. The uprising in Saint-Domingue had weakened French hopes in the Caribbean. War with Britain threatened to cut communications by sea. Holding a huge inland territory in North America became less useful and far more vulnerable. So he chose a dramatic solution. He sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States, which doubled the young nation's size at a stroke. The sale gave him money for European war, but its deeper consequence unfolded far beyond his control. It opened enormous space for American expansion and shifted the balance of power across a continent. Few decisions show his global reach more clearly. Even when he was focused on Europe, his choices could redirect the future of places he never ruled. A financial bargain became a turning point in world history. The Napoleonic Code still shapes laws around the world. Many conquerors are remembered for battles, but Napoleon also left behind a legal system with extraordinary endurance. Before his reforms, French law was tangled by region, custom, privilege, and old feudal arrangements. The new civil code aimed to make law clearer, more uniform, and more accessible to the state. It protected property rights, strengthened contracts, and confirmed many gains of the revolution. It also placed strong authority in the hands of fathers and husbands, which makes its legacy complicated. The remarkable part is how widely it traveled. French armies carried it into parts of Europe. Later, versions and influences reached territories far beyond France. Some countries adopted it directly. Others borrowed its structure or principles. It offered a model of law as a rational written system rather than a maze of inherited exceptions. Long after Napoleon's armies disappeared, the code continued to work through courts, constitutions, and legal education. His empire fell, but this framework kept moving. He escaped exile on Elba and reclaimed France without firing a shot. After his first abdication, Napoleon was given a tiny island realm in the Mediterranean. It looked like a neat ending to a vast career. Yet exile did not quiet him. On Elba, he governed energetically, watched Europe's politics, and understood that France was restless under the restored Bourbon monarchy. Then he made one of the boldest gambles of his life. He boarded a small force and landed on the French coast. Royal troops were sent to stop him. Instead of hiding behind his men, he stepped forward and invited them to shoot their emperor if they wished. The moment became legend because the soldiers did not fire. They rallied to him. As he moved north, support gathered like a rolling wave. The king fled Paris before Napoleon arrived. His return showed that power can live in memory, loyalty, and timing. For a brief moment, the defeated ruler became unstoppable again. At Austerlitz, he crushed two emperors in one brilliant trap. This battle became the masterpiece by which Napoleon's military genius was judged. He faced the armies of Russia and Austria near the town of Austerlitz, and he wanted them to believe he was weaker than he truly was. He deliberately made his right flank look vulnerable. The enemy took the bait and shifted strength toward that side. While they moved, their center became dangerously exposed. Napoleon had waited for exactly that mistake. At the right moment, he sent his troops up the Pratzen Heights, cutting into the heart of the Allied position. the battlefield changed with stunning speed. What had looked like weakness became a trap. The enemy line broke apart, and panic spread through forces that had expected victory. The result was not just another French success. It humbled two great imperial powers in a single day. It also fixed Napoleon's reputation as a commander who could turn deception, timing, and terrain into destiny. The Rosetta Stone was found during his failed Egyptian adventure. Napoleon's campaign in Egypt was a military gamble, but it carried an unusual cargo of knowledge. He brought scholars, engineers, artists, and scientists to study the land as French troops fought there. During this expedition, French soldiers working near the town of Rosetta found a dark stone slab with writing in 3 scripts. Its importance was not understood immediately by everyone who saw it, but scholars soon realized it held an extraordinary clue. The same decree appeared in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphs. Because ancient Greek could be read, the stone became a key to unlocking Egyptian writing that had been silent for centuries. The military campaign itself failed to give Napoleon lasting control of Egypt. British power at sea trapped French hopes and exposed the limits of his Eastern dream. Yet the expedition changed European understanding of ancient Egypt. From a failed invasion came one of the most important discoveries in the history of language. Waterloo ended his empire, but not his grip on history. The final campaign unfolded after his dramatic return from exile, when Europe moved quickly to destroy his restored power. Napoleon knew he had to strike before the Allied armies fully united. The battle near Waterloo became a brutal test of timing, weather, endurance, and command. Rain had turned the ground heavy, which slowed movement and delayed attacks. British and Allied troops under Wellington held firm against repeated pressure. Prussian forces under Blücher arrived at the crucial moment, turning the struggle against the French. By evening, Napoleon's last great army was breaking. The defeat ended his rule and sent him toward a much harsher exile. Yet the end of his empire did not end his influence. Waterloo became a symbol of final downfall, but also a gateway into legend. People kept arguing about his choices, his enemies, and his genius. Few defeated rulers have remained so alive in public imagination after their power vanished. Napoleon was not unusually short by the standards of his time. The famous image of a tiny, angry conqueror is one of history's most persistent misunderstandings. Part of the confusion came from different measuring systems. French measurements from his era did not match British ones exactly, which helped distort later impressions of his height. He was around average for a Frenchman of his time. The nickname Little Corporal did not originally mean he was physically small. It was an affectionate military nickname connected to his closeness with soldiers and his early identity as an artillery officer. British caricaturists then turned him into a comic figure, making him look smaller to mock his ambition. The image was useful propaganda because it made a dangerous enemy seem ridiculous. Over time, the joke became accepted as fact. This myth shows how powerfully cartoons and insults can shape memory. Napoleon's actual height matters less than the lesson behind the myth. History can be shortened by repetition, even when the person was not. He was born on Corsica soon after France took control. Napoleon entered the world on an island with a fierce identity and a recent history of resistance. Corsica had only recently come under French authority, and many families still felt strong ties to Italian language and culture. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, had once supported the Corsican patriot Pasquale Poli before adapting to the new French order. That shift mattered because it allowed young Napoleon to receive opportunities within France's military education system. Yet his early background left him with a sense of distance from the polished society he later tried to dominate. He was not born into the heart of Parisian power. He came from a provincial noble family on an island that had been absorbed by a larger state. This gave him both resentment and ambition. He understood what it meant to be underestimated. The boy from Ajaccio grew up watching identity, loyalty, and survival change with politics, and that lesson never left him. His family once spoke Italian before he became France's ruler. The Bonaparte household belonged to a Corsican world where Italian dialects and traditions were deeply rooted. The family name itself was originally Bonaparte, before Napoleon later adopted the more French-looking spelling. This detail may seem small, but it reveals how carefully identity could be shaped in an age of revolution and empire. As a young student in France, he had to master a language that was not native to his childhood home. His accent marked him as different, and classmates sometimes mocked him for it. That experience seems to have hardened him. He learned that belonging could be won through achievement rather than birth alone. Over time, he turned himself into the ultimate symbol of France, even though his origins were more complex than nationalist legend allowed. The transformation was remarkable. A boy from a Corsican family with Italian cultural roots became the ruler who claimed to embody French glory before the watching world. As a child, he felt like an outsider in French schools. Military education took Napoleon away from Corsica and placed him among boys who often looked down on him. He was not wealthy in the way many aristocratic students were. His accent, manners, and island background made him stand apart. Instead of becoming charming, he became intense. He read widely, withdrew often, and developed a sharp pride that could easily turn into anger. Teachers noticed his ability in mathematics, which made artillery a natural path for him. Other subjects did not always interest him in the same way. What mattered most was that school taught him how hierarchy worked. He saw how birth, polish, and connections shaped opportunity. He also learned that talent could become a weapon against contempt. The loneliness of those years helped form the self-command that later impressed soldiers and frightened rivals. He did not grow into power as someone comfortable with acceptance. He grew into it as someone determined to prove the world wrong. Mathematics helped shape the commander he would become. Artillery in the 18th century was not simply about courage. It demanded calculation. A gunner had to understand angles, distances, weight, powder, timing, and terrain. Napoleon's strength in mathematics gave him a practical foundation for war. He learned to think in terms of placement and effect. Where should cannon be positioned? How could fire open a gap? Which point in a line was weak enough to break? This habit of mind carried into his larger campaigns. He often looked at battlefields as systems of pressure rather than confused masses of men. That did not make war clean or mechanical, but it helped him see opportunities quickly. His early technical training also separated him from commanders who relied mainly on noble status or traditional cavalry glory. Artillery taught him that modern power could come from precision. It gave him a way to convert abstract thought into physical force. Before he commanded empires, he learned to command trajectories. Artillery gave Napoleon his first great path to power. The gunner's branch was a doorway for talented young officers because it rewarded training more than aristocratic glamour. Napoleon entered it at a moment when France was being transformed by revolution and war. Skilled officers were desperately needed, and old barriers were breaking down. Artillery suited him perfectly. It required concentration, discipline, and an ability to make violence serve a larger plan. Cannons could decide a siege, shatter a formation, or support an assault at the decisive instant. Napoleon understood their value early. He was not merely fascinated by firepower. He saw that the right guns in the right place could change the fate of an army. This insight helped him stand out during the crisis at Toulon. While others saw confusion, he saw positions, ranges, and vulnerabilities. His rise did not begin with a throne or a crown. It began with gun crews, muddy batteries, and the cold mathematics of force. The siege of Toulon made him famous at only 24. Toulon was a crisis that could have ruined the French Republic. The city had opened itself to British and Allied forces, giving them control of a major naval base on the Mediterranean. For revolutionary France, this was dangerous and humiliating. Napoleon arrived as a young artillery officer and quickly saw the key to the problem. Instead of attacking everything at once, French forces needed to capture positions that would make the harbor impossible for enemy ships to hold. His plan focused on pressure at the right point. After fierce fighting, the Allied fleet withdrew, and Toulon was retaken. The victory brought Napoleon sudden recognition. He was promoted to brigadier general while still astonishingly young. This was the moment when his name began to matter beyond a small circle of officers. Toulon showed his gift for seeing the essential problem inside a larger confusion. It also showed revolutionary leaders that this ambitious Corsican could deliver results when France most needed them. Paris first feared him after he crushed a royalist uprising. In the autumn of 1795, the revolutionary government faced a dangerous revolt in the capital. Royalist forces threatened the National Convention, and the situation could have spiraled into the collapse of the regime. Napoleon was given responsibility for defending the government. He acted with ruthless clarity. Cannons were placed to control the streets, and grape shot was used against the advancing insurgents. The violence was brief, shocking, and decisive. It saved the government, but it also revealed the kind of man Napoleon could be when order and power were at stake. To supporters, he had rescued the Republic from counter-revolution. To others, he had shown how quickly political crisis could be answered by military force. His reward was rapid advancement and a stronger position in Paris. This episode mattered because it linked his future to the survival of the revolutionary state. The capital learned his name not through speeches, but through the thunder of artillery. Josephine nearly missed marrying the man who would crown Europe. Their relationship began in the unstable social world of post-revolutionary France. Josephine de Beauharnais was a widow who had survived the Terror, endured prison, and moved within influential circles. Napoleon was younger, intense, ambitious, and already rising. Their match was not obvious. She had experience, elegance, and connections. He had energy, hunger, and a future that was still uncertain. There were hesitations before the marriage, encoding practical concerns and differences in temperament. Yet he became deeply attached to her. His letters from the early period reveal longing, jealousy, and emotional dependence that can surprise people who know only the stern emperor. Josephine brought him access to networks that mattered in Paris, while he offered the promise of extraordinary ascent. Their marriage became one of the great personal dramas of his life. It mixed affection with betrayal, tenderness with calculation, and private feeling with public ambition. Before the imperial throne, there was a risky union between two survivors. He left for Italy 2 days after his wedding. The timing was almost unbelievable. Napoleon married Josephine, then quickly departed to command the army of Italy. Romance and war collided at the very start of their life together. The army he inherited was poorly supplied, tired and overlooked by the government in Paris. Many expected little from it. Napoleon saw opportunity. Italy offered a theatre where speed, nerve, and bold leadership could produce dramatic results. His letters to Josephine from the campaign were passionate and sometimes desperate, yet his military energy did not slow. He drove his army through a series of victories that stunned Austria and transformed his reputation. The contrast is striking. At home, he was a newlywed writing with almost feverish emotion. In the field, he was a commander reshaping the balance of power. This moment reveals how his life often worked. Personal desire did not pause ambition. Love and conquest advanced together, and the world began to notice the young general. The Italian campaign made Napoleon a celebrity across France. Before Italy, Napoleon was promising. After Italy, he became a national phenomenon. The campaign showed France a commander who seemed able to turn hunger, poor equipment, and difficult terrain into victory. He defeated Austrian and Allied forces repeatedly, using speed and concentration to keep enemies off balance. He also understood publicity with unusual skill. Reports from the army presented him as fearless, brilliant, and close to his soldiers. The French public followed his progress with growing excitement. Loot, treaties, and captured standards gave the victories a visible reality. Paris saw not only a general, but a figure who seemed to embody revolutionary energy. He negotiated like a statesman, commanded like a veteran, and spoke as if destiny had chosen him. The campaign also made him dangerously independent. Success gave him fame that no politician could easily control. In Italy, Napoleon did more than win battles. He created the public image that would carry him towards supreme power. He used newspapers to turn battlefield victories into legend. Napoleon understood something that many soldiers before him had missed. A battle was not finished when the smoke cleared. It continued in the minds of people who heard about it afterward. During his Italian campaign, he encouraged reports that made his achievements feel dramatic, personal, and almost inevitable. These bulletins did more than announce success. They shaped emotion. They presented hardship as heroism. They made soldiers feel seen by their commander. They gave civilians a story to believe in during years of uncertainty. Napoleon could describe a march, a charge, or a captured standard in language that made the army seem like the living heart of France. He knew that reputation could move faster than troops. A frightened enemy might fight differently if it already believed him unstoppable. A tired nation might accept greater sacrifice if it felt victory was close. His genius was not only in winning attention, it was in making attention serve power. His soldiers called him the Little Corporal with real affection. The nickname sounds simple, but it carried a deep emotional charge inside the army. It suggested closeness rather than distance. Many rulers stood above their soldiers as remote figures of rank and ceremony. Napoleon worked hard to appear different. He rode among the troops, spoke to veterans, inspected equipment, and shared the language of military hardship. The name came from the world of campfires, mud, and long roads. It made him feel like a commander who understood the men beneath the uniforms. That connection mattered because his campaigns demanded extraordinary endurance. Soldiers followed him through hunger, exhaustion, and terrifying battles because they believed he saw them as more than pieces on a map. He rewarded bravery with medals and promotions. He also knew how to turn recognition into loyalty. The affectionate title helped build a bond that no decree could create. It gave the army a family feeling around a man who asked almost everything from it. He often remembered soldiers by name after meeting them once. This gift became part of the spell he cast over the army. Imagine being a private soldier in a vast imperial force, then hearing the commander remember your face or recall some detail from an earlier encounter. Whether every story was perfect or polished by legend, the effect was powerful. Napoleon made ordinary men feel briefly important inside a machine of war that could easily swallow them. He might ask about a wound, a regiment, or a previous battle. Such moments traveled quickly through the ranks. They told soldiers that courage could be noticed by the highest figure in the empire. This personal touch worked alongside promotions and honors. It made military service feel like a ladder where merit might rise. In a society still marked by revolution, that promise mattered deeply. His memory became a tool of command because it turned loyalty into something intimate. For a soldier, being remembered could feel like being chosen by history. Napoleon could dictate letters while thinking about several subjects. His working habits astonished many people around him. Secretaries found themselves racing to keep up as he moved from military orders to diplomacy, from finance to family matters, and then back to troop movements. He did not treat government as a slow procession of papers. He attacked it. In one sitting, he might shape instructions for a minister, review a report from a distant army, correct administrative details, and send sharp personal notes. This ability gave him an enormous reach over the machinery of state. It also created pressure on everyone nearby. Officials learned that vague answers could bring a storm of questions. He wanted figures, names, routes, quantities, and explanations. His mind seemed to leap between topics without losing the central thread. The result was a government that could feel energized and suffocated at the same time. Napoleon's attention was a source of power, but it also meant that almost nothing escaped his demand for control. He slept surprisingly little during the busiest moments of power. Accounts of Napoleon's rest have often been exaggerated, yet there is no doubt that he could work through punishing schedules when events demanded it. He sometimes slept in short bursts, rising to read dispatches or issue orders during the night. Campaign life trained him to rest whenever a chance appeared. A chair, a carriage, or a brief pause could become enough. This flexibility helped him during crises because war rarely followed a comfortable rhythm. Messages arrived late. Roads failed. Enemies moved unexpectedly. A commander who needed perfect conditions would fall behind events. Napoleon's ability to wake quickly and return to work gave him a practical advantage. It also added to his aura. People around him saw a man who seemed driven by an inner engine that did not fully stop. But such habits carried a cost. Fatigue can sharpen urgency at first, then cloud judgment later. His energy was extraordinary, but even extraordinary energy had limits. His handwriting was so messy that clerks struggled to read it. The documents of Napoleon's life reveal a curious contrast. His thoughts could be precise, but his script often looked hurried and difficult. This was not just a charming flaw. It reflected the speed at which he worked and the pressure surrounding his decisions. He wrote notes in motion, during campaigns, after meetings, or while juggling urgent business. Secretaries became essential because spoken command suited him better than careful penmanship. Dictation allowed him to pour out instructions at the pace of thought. When he did write by hand, the result could challenge even trained readers. The messiness also reminds us that historical giants remain human in the smallest ways. Behind the polished portraits and marble tombs was a man whose papers could frustrate the people required to interpret them. Empires depend on grand strategy, but they also depend on legible orders. In his case, the machinery of rule often had to translate genius from a scribble. He carried a traveling library during some of his campaigns. War did not silence Napoleon's appetite for reading. Even when armies were moving, he wanted books near him. The subjects could range widely, from history to literature, from politics to military theory. Reading gave him more than escape. It gave him examples. He studied rulers, republics, ancient battles, and human ambition through the lives of others. A campaign carriage with books inside says something important about him. He did not imagine command as muscle alone. He saw it as memory, comparison, and judgment. The past was a storehouse of warnings and methods. Books allowed him to keep that storehouse close, even when surrounded by mud, scouts, and maps. This habit also helped feed his sense of destiny. He measured himself against earlier figures and sometimes seemed to perform for posterity while still alive. The library on the road was a symbol of the way his mind worked. He carried history because he meant to join it. Ancient heroes shaped how Napoleon imagined his own destiny. From youth, Napoleon read stories of commanders and rulers who rose above ordinary life. These figures gave him a language for ambition. He was especially drawn to men who combined military brilliance with political transformation. In those lives, he saw that war could be a doorway into law, authority, and memory. Ancient history offered examples of glory, but also danger. Victors could become tyrants. Republics could fear the very generals who saved them. Napoleon understood these tensions, yet he did not step away from them. Instead, he walked deeper into the pattern. He wanted to be seen not merely as a successful officer, but as someone whose actions belonged to a larger historical drama. That belief shaped the way he spoke, posed, ruled, and fought. It helped him endure risk because he imagined risk as part of greatness. His heroes did not simply inspire him. They gave him a stage on which to place himself. He admired Julius Caesar and learned from Roman ambition. Caesar offered Napoleon a dangerous and fascinating model. Here was a general who won loyalty from soldiers, crossed from military fame into political command, and forced a republic to confront the power of one extraordinary man. Napoleon knew that story well. He saw how battlefield success could become authority at home. He also saw how public generosity, speed, and theatrical confidence could disarm opponents. Rome gave him more than decoration for speeches. It gave him a political grammar. Consuls, eagles, triumphal imagery, and imperial references all helped him connect his rule to something older than the French Revolution. Yet admiration did not mean imitation in every detail. Napoleon lived in a world of newspapers, modern bureaucracy, and mass armies. He adapted ancient lessons to a new age. Caesar's shadow helped him imagine how a soldier might become the center of the state. It also warned, silently and constantly, that extraordinary power creates extraordinary fear. Napoleon brought scholars to Egypt alongside soldiers and cannons. The expedition to Egypt was unusual because it was both an invasion and an intellectual project. Along with troops, Napoleon gathered experts who could study geography, plants, animals, monuments, languages, engineering, and ancient remains. They were not decorative passengers. They measured, drew, catalogued, and investigated on a scale that astonished Europe. This mixture of conquest and research reveals the strange character of the campaign. Napoleon wanted military advantage, but he also wanted prestige. Egypt connected him to antiquity and offered a chance to appear as a bringer of knowledge as well as force. The scholars worked under difficult conditions, often amid disease, heat, danger, and uncertainty. Their findings later contributed to a monumental published record that fascinated readers far beyond France. The presence of this learned company did not make the campaign peaceful or benign. It did make it historically distinctive. Napoleon carried war into Egypt, but he also carried instruments, notebooks, questions, and a hunger to possess the past. His Egyptian expedition helped launch modern Egyptology in Europe. The long scholarly aftermath of the campaign changed how Europeans studied ancient Egypt. Before this period, many monuments were known through travelers' accounts, fragments, and speculation. The French expedition produced detailed observations that gave scholars a richer foundation. Temples, inscriptions, statues, landscapes, and artifacts were recorded with great care. The resulting work fed public fascination and helped move the subject from romantic wonder towards systematic study. This did not happen in a clean or simple way. It was tied to empire, military ambition, and the removal of antiquities. Still, the intellectual consequences were enormous. Egypt became a field of organized research for European institutions. Artists, linguists, collectors, and historians all became part of a widening conversation. Napoleon himself did not unlock every mystery, but his campaign accelerated attention in a dramatic way. The desert expedition failed as lasting conquest, yet it opened a scholarly doorway that many others rushed through. Knowledge became one of its most enduring trophies. He visited the Great Pyramid during his strange Eastern campaign. The image of Napoleon before the pyramids has become one of the most memorable scenes of his early career. Whether every detail of later stories is reliable or not, the encounter mattered symbolically. He stood before monuments that had already survived thousands of years of kings, invasions, religions, and empires. For a man obsessed with history, the setting was irresistible. Egypt offered him a scale of time far larger than European politics. The pyramids made even imperial ambition feel temporary. Yet he also used their grandeur to elevate his own campaign. He wanted the soldiers to feel that they were acting under the gaze of history itself. This was typical of him. He could turn a landscape into a lesson and a march into a moment of destiny. The pyramids did not belong to his story, but he tried to place himself beside them. That effort reveals both his imagination and the audacity of his self-belief. The Battle of the Nile trapped his army far from France. While Napoleon fought on land, the fate of his expedition depended on the sea. That was where Britain held its greatest strength. The French fleet anchored near Egypt, and Admiral Horatio Nelson found it. The battle that followed was devastating. British ships attacked with boldness and destroyed or captured much of the French naval force. The consequences were enormous. Napoleon's soldiers had won victories ashore, but now they were cut off from easy return and reinforcement. The Egyptian adventure became a cage as much as a campaign. Supplies, communication, and long-term planning all grew harder. This defeat exposed a central weakness in Napoleon's global ambitions. He could dominate armies on land, but Britain's naval power could still reach around him and ruin his larger design. The battle changed the meaning of the entire expedition. What had looked like a daring step toward Eastern glory became a stranded occupation under the shadow of the Royal Navy. Napoleon abandoned Egypt and returned to chase power in Paris. Leaving the army in Egypt was one of the coldest decisions of his career. France was politically unstable, and Napoleon sensed opportunity at home. Rather than remain with a campaign that had lost its strategic promise, he slipped away by sea with a small group of companions. The move was risky because British patrols might have captured him. It was also controversial because many soldiers were left behind to face the consequences. Yet from Napoleon's point of view, history was moving in Paris, not Cairo. He understood that a general could lose relevance if he stayed too long in a failing theatre. Back in France, he presented himself not as a deserter, but as the man needed to rescue the nation. This ability to transform a dangerous retreat into political advantage was astonishing. He left behind dust, disease, and trapped troops. Ahead of him waited the crisis that would allow him to seize the state. The coup of Brumaire turned a general into France's ruler. The government of the Directory had become weak, distrusted, and exhausted. Many French citizens feared both royalist reaction and renewed revolutionary disorder. Powerful figures began looking for a solution, and Napoleon became the instrument they hoped to use. The coup took place in the revolutionary calendar's month of Brumaire. It was not a smooth, heroic seizure, despite later legend. There was confusion, shouting, hesitation, and real danger. Napoleon faced resistance from legislators who understood that the Republic was being overthrown in practice. His brother Lucien played a crucial role in rescuing the moment politically. Soldiers then cleared the way for a new system. The result was the consulate, with Napoleon as first consul. This was the turning point where fame became direct authority. He did not yet call himself emperor, but the direction was clear. The sword had entered the heart of government, and France now revolved around the ambition of one man. As first consul, he rebuilt France with astonishing speed. Once in control, Napoleon moved with the urgency of a man determined to make disorder impossible. France had been through years of revolutionary upheaval, and many institutions needed stability. He centralized administration, strengthened finances, reformed education, reorganized justice, and restored confidence in government authority. The changes were not simply about efficiency. They were designed to bind the nation to him. Officials owed advancement to performance and loyalty. Citizens saw roads, courts, schools, and tax systems become more predictable. After so much uncertainty, order had enormous appeal. Napoleon understood that power lasts longer when people feel daily life improving. His rule reduced some revolutionary freedoms, but it also preserved important gains by making them workable within a strong state. This is why his domestic achievement cannot be dismissed as mere dictatorship. He created structures that outlived his battlefield fortunes. France, under the consulate, became a laboratory of centralized modern government, and Napoleon stood at its busy center. The Bank of France began under Napoleon's careful supervision. Financial stability was essential after the upheavals of revolution. Paper money had collapsed in value, trust was damaged, and the state needed reliable credit. Napoleon understood that armies, roads, salaries, and administration all depended on money that people believed in. The creation of the Bank of France helped restore confidence by giving the country a stronger financial institution. It supported currency stability and helped manage credit in a more disciplined way. This was not the kind of achievement that looks dramatic in a painting, but it mattered profoundly. A ruler who cannot pay cannot govern effectively for long. Napoleon's attention to finance shows that he was not only a battlefield commander. He cared about the practical bones of power. He wanted a state that could collect, borrow, spend, and endure. The bank became part of that vision. It helped make authority feel solid again after years when the revolution had shaken the foundations of economic trust. He created the Legion of Honor to reward service. Napoleon knew that a new France needed symbols of achievement. The revolution had attacked old noble privileges, but people still wanted recognition. The Legion of Honor offered a solution. It rewarded service to the nation rather than inherited rank. Soldiers, officials, scientists, and civilians could all be honored through it. Critics claimed it resembled the old decorations of monarchy, but Napoleon argued that men are moved by distinctions. He believed public honor could bind talent to the state. The award also revealed his understanding of human nature. Pay mattered. Promotion mattered. But visible recognition could inspire devotion in a different way. A cross on a uniform or coat told the world that a person had served with distinction. It created a new aristocracy of merit, at least in theory. The order survived many political changes because it answered a lasting need. People want their sacrifices to be seen, and Napoleon built a system to make that visible. France's prefect system still carries traces of his rule. Napoleon wanted authority to reach every part of the country with discipline and clarity. The prefect became a key figure in that design. Appointed by the central government, a prefect represented the state in a department and ensured that national policy was carried out locally. This system reduced the independence of local political life, but it also made administration more consistent. Paris could know more, direct more, and demand more from the provinces. For Napoleon, this was essential. A state at war needed taxes, conscripts, roads, police reports, and obedience. The prefect was the channel through which central power became practical reality. This arrangement helped create the highly centralized character associated with modern France. It shows the administrative side of his genius, which can be less famous than his battles, but just as consequential. He did not merely conquer territory, he organized it. His hand can still be felt in the shape of French governance. Napoleon made public education a weapon of national power. Schools mattered to Napoleon because they shaped the future servants of the state. He wanted trained officials, disciplined officers, loyal administrators, and citizens formed by a common national culture. The lycées created under his rule became important institutions for secondary education. Their purpose was not simply to encourage free curiosity. They were meant to produce capable young men who could serve France efficiently. Mathematics, history, discipline, and hierarchy all had their place. Education became part of statecraft. A classroom could prepare the mind for a ministry, a courtroom, or an army staff. This vision reflected both revolutionary inheritance and imperial control. Talent should be developed, but it should be directed. Napoleon had benefited from military schooling himself, so he knew how powerful structured education could be for ambitious outsiders. By organizing public instruction, he invested in a future bureaucracy loyal to the nation and, in practice, to the system he commanded. Knowledge became another instrument of power. He reconciled France with the Catholic Church after revolutionary chaos. The revolution had torn deeply into religious life. Churches had been closed, clergy persecuted, property seized, and communities divided. By the time Napoleon rose, many French people wanted peace between the state and religion. He saw the political value immediately. The Concordat with Pope Pius VII restored a formal relationship with the Church while keeping it under state control in crucial ways. Catholic worship could return openly, but the Church did not regain all its former privileges. Bishops would be nominated by the government. Clergy would be paid by the state. This settlement did not satisfy everyone, but it calmed a dangerous source of conflict. Napoleon approached religion less as a private devotion than as a social force. He believed people needed spiritual order, and he wanted that order attached to his regime. The agreement helped heal wounds left by revolutionary extremism. It also showed his talent for turning compromise into a pillar of authority. His coronation used ancient symbols to invent a modern empire. The imperial ceremony drew from many layers of history. Roman eagles, royal robes, sacred music, and court ritual helped give the new regime an air of age and inevitability. Yet the empire itself was born from revolution, military success, and political calculation. That combination made the event fascinating. Napoleon was not simply reviving the old monarchy. He was building a new form of authority that borrowed whatever symbols could strengthen it. The ceremony announced continuity while concealing rupture. It suggested that France had passed beyond instability into grandeur. At the same time, it made clear that the center of this grandeur was a soldier who had risen through talent and opportunity. Every object carried meaning. Every gesture was part of the message. The past became raw material for a new political identity. Napoleon understood that people do not live by laws alone. They also respond to spectacle, memory, and the feeling that power has a shape. The imperial crown transformed revolutionary France into hereditary monarchy. This was one of the great ironies of Napoleon's career. The revolution had attacked hereditary rule, yet his empire eventually depended on dynasty. The shift did not happen because France simply forgot its recent past. It happened because stability became a national obsession. Napoleon argued that succession would prevent chaos after his death. If power had a clear heir, the state might survive without another struggle. But the move also exposed how far the revolution's political ideals had been narrowed. A system born from the overthrow of kings now accepted an emperor whose family would inherit authority. Supporters saw this as practical necessity. Critics saw betrayal. Napoleon tried to resolve the contradiction by claiming that his monarchy rested on merit, law, and popular approval rather than ancient privilege. Still, a crown passed through blood carries its own meaning. The empire turned revolutionary energy into a throne, and that transformation remains one of history's most striking reversals. Beethoven first admired Napoleon, then furiously rejected his empire. The composer once saw Napoleon as a symbol of republican promise. To many observers beyond France, the young general seemed to represent talent, rising against old aristocratic systems. Beethoven, who valued human freedom and heroic struggle, was drawn to that image. He planned to dedicate his third symphony to him. Then Napoleon made himself emperor. The news enraged Beethoven because it seemed to prove that the supposed champion of liberty had become another seeker of personal domination. According to a famous account, he scratched out the dedication with such force that the paper was damaged. The symphony became known as the Eroica, and its connection to Napoleon remained as a broken expectation rather than a tribute. This episode shows how widely his choices resonated. He was not only judged in palaces and parliaments. Artists watched him too. For Beethoven, the coronation turned a hero into a warning about ambition's power to corrupt greatness. Napoleon's image spread through paintings, coins, medals, and statues. He understood visual power with extraordinary skill. In an age before photography, the ruler's face had to travel through objects. Portraits showed him calm, commanding, and touched by destiny. Coins placed his profile into daily exchange, so people handled his authority with every transaction. Medals turned victories and state events into durable memory. Statues gave his regime public weight in streets and institutions. These images did not simply record how he looked. They taught people how to see him. Sometimes he appeared as a soldier. Sometimes he appeared as a lawgiver. Sometimes he looked almost Roman. Each version served a purpose. The repetition made his presence feel unavoidable, even to citizens who never saw him in person. This was propaganda in the broadest sense, not merely lies, but the construction of a political atmosphere. Napoleon built a visual empire alongside the military one. His face became an instrument of rule. Jacques-Louis David helped turn Napoleon into living mythology. David was one of the most important painters of the age, and his art gave Napoleon a grandeur that reality alone could not provide. The famous image of him crossing the Alps shows a rearing horse, a heroic gesture, and names of earlier conquerors carved into stone. The actual crossing was far less theatrical. Napoleon rode a mule through harsh mountain conditions. David's painting did not aim at literal accuracy. It created an idea. It showed the leader as energy, command, and destiny in human form. This is why the portrait mattered so much. It gave the public a Napoleon larger than life and easy to remember. Art turned hardship into triumph before viewers ever heard the details. David had already painted revolution, sacrifice, and civic virtue. Under Napoleon, he helped transform military power into legend. The result was not just a portrait. It was a political invention that still shapes how people imagine him. His bicorn hat became one of history's most recognizable silhouettes. The hat worked because it was simple, distinctive, and instantly readable from a distance. Napoleon usually wore it sideways, which made his outline different from many officers who wore similar hats front to back. On a battlefield or parade ground, that silhouette helped people identify him quickly. Over time, the object became almost inseparable from the man. It appears in caricatures, paintings, films, museum displays, and popular memory. The hat did not need jewels to become powerful. Its plainness made it stronger. It suggested military focus rather than courtly decoration. It also gave artists and enemies an easy symbol. A small shape could represent an entire empire. That is the strange magic of political imagery. A ruler may build laws, fight wars, and command millions, yet the public may remember him through a single object. Napoleon's hat became a portable emblem of ambition, command, and the drama of an age. He preferred simple military dress over dazzling royal costumes. Napoleon knew that restraint could be more impressive than splendor. At court, lavish clothing could signal wealth and rank, but he often favored the recognizable uniform style of a working commander. This choice helped him preserve the image of a soldier among courtiers. It reminded people that his authority came from service, victory, and discipline rather than inherited luxury. The simplicity was carefully chosen. It did not mean he rejected ceremony. He used ceremony brilliantly when it suited him. But in daily appearance, he often understood the value of contrast. Around glittering officials, a plain uniform could draw the eye more strongly than jewels. It suggested a man too occupied with destiny to be trapped by decoration. This image appealed to soldiers and civilians who admired efficiency after revolutionary excess and aristocratic display. His clothing became part of his political language. It said that he belonged to action first, even when surrounded by imperial grandeur. Napoleon's grey coat became a symbol soldiers could recognize. On campaign, the familiar coat helped create the impression of a commander who shared the rough world of the army. It was not glamorous, but that was precisely why it mattered. Soldiers could see in it a figure who belonged among roads, camps, rain, and cold mornings. The garment became associated with endurance and presence. When men glimpsed him wearing it, the effect could be emotional. The emperor was not only a distant name on orders. He was there, rubbed against the weather like them, watching the same ground before battle. Such symbols are powerful because they simplify loyalty. A coat becomes a memory. A memory becomes a story. A story becomes morale. Later generations preserved the image because it captured a central part of his legend. Napoleon could stand inside enormous ceremonies, yet the grey coat told a different tale. It presented him as the soldier ruler, close enough to inspire men facing danger. He used speed and surprise to make larger armies helpless. Napoleon's best campaigns often depended on striking before his enemies understood the true situation. He looked for gaps between allied forces, then moved hard toward the point where a decisive blow could split them apart. This method required courage, because rapid movement could expose his own troops if the plan failed. It also required trust in subordinates, accurate scouting, and relentless pressure. When it worked, opponents with impressive numbers found themselves unable to use them. One army might be beaten before another arrived. A commander might prepare for a battle in one place, while Napoleon appeared somewhere else. The result was confusion that spread through headquarters and ranks alike. He made time itself feel hostile to his enemies. They were always hurrying, always reacting, always discovering that yesterday's plan had already expired. This was the heart of his operational brilliance. He did not simply defeat armies. He made them feel late to their own defeat. His core system allowed armies to move separately and unite quickly. One of Napoleon's greatest military innovations was not a single weapon. It was a way of organizing force. A corps was like a small army within the larger army, with infantry, cavalry, artillery, and support elements able to operate together for a time. This meant his forces did not always need to march in one huge mass. They could spread across roads, move faster, gather supplies more easily, and threatened several directions at once. The genius came when these separate bodies converged at the decisive moment. An enemy might think it faced one isolated formation, only to discover that others were closing in from nearby routes. This demanded careful timing, reliable commanders, and strong staff work. When it functioned well, it gave Napoleon flexibility that many opponents struggled to match. The system turned distance into opportunity. It allowed his army to feel scattered one day and concentrated the next, as if the battlefield itself had suddenly tightened around the enemy. Marshals under Napoleon became legends in their own right. Napoleon's empire was not carried by one mind alone. Around him stood commanders whose names became part of the drama of the age. Some were fierce cavalry leaders. Some were masters of discipline. Others were brilliant at holding a line, storming a position, or managing a retreat. Their personalities could be difficult, proud, jealous, and theatrical, but that made them memorable. Napoleon needed them because no emperor could be everywhere at once. He raised many of these men from backgrounds that would have limited them under older systems. Revolution and war opened doors for talent, and the martial arte became a kind of military nobility based on service. Yet their fame also carried tension. A marshal who won too much glory could become hard to control. A marshal who failed at the wrong moment could endanger an entire campaign. Their stories remind us that the Napoleonic Wars were not only about one extraordinary figure, they were also about the men drawn into his orbit. Marshal Ney was called the bravest of the brave. Michel Ney's reputation came from a kind of courage that seemed almost reckless. He led from the front, exposed himself to danger, and became a symbol of battlefield nerve. Soldiers admired that because courage is contagious when fear is everywhere. Ney could steady men by the force of his presence. His red hair, strong voice, and aggressive style made him unforgettable. During the retreat from Russia, he became especially famous for helping protect the rear of the army under appalling conditions. That role demanded more than bravery. It demanded endurance, discipline, and the ability to keep men moving when hope was disappearing. Yet Ney's career also shows that courage is not the same as perfect judgment. At Waterloo, his attacks became part of the controversy surrounding Napoleon's final defeat. Still, his legend survived because people remembered the quality that never seemed to fail him. In an age crowded with bold men, Ney stood out as almost fearlessly alive. Davout won at Austerlitz against overwhelming Prussian numbers. Louis-Nicolas Davout was not the most glamorous of Napoleon's marshals, but he was one of the most formidable. At Austerlitz, his corps faced the main Prussian army, while Napoleon was fighting elsewhere near Jena. Davout had fewer men, yet his troops fought with extraordinary discipline. The Prussian commanders expected to break through, but instead they met steady fire, controlled movements, and stubborn resistance. Davout handled the battle with cold precision. His soldiers absorbed pressure, countered attacks, and slowly turned a dangerous situation into a remarkable victory. The result was astonishing because it shattered the idea that Prussia's old military reputation guaranteed success. Davout proved that organization and command could overcome numbers when used with clarity. This battle also showed the strength of Napoleon's corps system at its best. A single corps could survive and win independently. Davout earned lasting respect because he did not merely hold on. He defeated a larger enemy in one of the age's most impressive actions. Napoleon's enemies studied his methods while fighting to destroy him. Defeat became a harsh education for Europe's armies. Every time Napoleon won, his opponents asked what had gone wrong. They studied his speed, corps organization, use of artillery, command style, and ability to concentrate force. Some reforms came slowly, but they came. Prussia is the clearest example. After humiliation, reformers worked to rebuild the army, improve training, broaden military service, and develop better staff systems. Austria adapted too, though unevenly. Russia learned from its own encounters and became more careful about trading space for time. Britain studied him through a different lens, using money, sea power, alliances, and patient resistance. This is one of the great ironies of his career. His genius forced his enemies to become better. He raised the standard of war so dramatically that surviving states had to evolve or be crushed again. By the end, the coalition facing him was not the same kind of opponent he had once dazzled. It had learned from pain. Austerlitz was planned around mist, weakness, and perfect timing. Before the battle began, Napoleon read the ground and the psychology of his enemies with extraordinary care. He wanted the opposing army to believe his right side could be overwhelmed. To encourage this, he made that part of his line look dangerously thin. The morning mist helped conceal movements and created uncertainty. Allied commanders thought they saw a chance to roll up the French flank. As they shifted troops away from the center, they unknowingly opened the place Napoleon intended to strike. He waited until the enemy had committed itself, then ordered the attack toward the heights that controlled the field. The timing had to be exact. Too early, and the trap might fail. Too late, and his flank could collapse. The beauty of the plan lay in its patience. He allowed the enemy to become confident before revealing the danger. Austerlitz remains famous because it was not merely won by strength. It was won by invitation. The son of Austerlitz became part of his personal legend. After the battle, memory wrapped the day in symbolism. The morning light breaking through mist became known as the son of Austerlitz, and Napoleon later used that image to stir emotion among his troops. It was more than weather. It became a sign of fortune, brilliance, and destiny. Armies live on stories, especially when they are asked to suffer. A phrase like that could recall past glory before a new battle began. It could make veterans feel that they had once stood inside history's favor. Napoleon understood the emotional power of such memories. He did not rely only on orders and logistics. He fed the imagination of his soldiers. The sun became shorthand for the moment when his genius seemed undeniable and the empire seemed blessed by victory. Of course, weather has no loyalty to rulers. Yet symbols do not need to be literally true to be powerful. They only need people to believe they remember them. Jena shattered Prussia and changed the map of Central Europe. Prussia had once carried a fearsome military reputation, inherited from the age of Frederick the Great. Many assumed its army would stand as a serious barrier to French dominance. The campaign of 1806 destroyed that confidence with stunning speed. At Jena and nearby Austerlitz, Prussian forces were beaten so badly that the state itself seemed to buckle. Fortresses surrendered. Armies disintegrated. Berlin fell. The shock was not only military, it was psychological and political. An old power had been exposed as rigid, outdated, and unprepared for the tempo of Napoleonic War. The defeat forced deep reforms that would shape Prussia's future. It also allowed Napoleon to reorganize German lands under French influence. For Central Europe, the consequences were immense. States were rearranged, old assumptions collapsed, and people began asking what kind of nation could survive in a world of mass armies and rapid government. Jena was not just a defeat. It was a forced awakening. The Confederation of the Rhine ended the Holy Roman Empire. For centuries, the Holy Roman Empire had been a complex structure of princes, cities, church lands, and shifting loyalties. It was ancient, prestigious, and often bewildering. Napoleon's victories made its survival impossible. By creating the Confederation of the Rhine, he gathered many German states under his influence and detached them from the old imperial framework. The Emperor Francis II gave up the Holy Roman Imperial title in 1806, bringing a 1,000-year political tradition to an end. That was an astonishing moment. A structure that had claimed continuity with Rome vanished under the pressure of a modern conqueror. Napoleon did not simply defeat armies in German lands. He changed the constitutional shape of Central Europe. Smaller states were reorganized, enlarged, or absorbed. Rulers who cooperated gained status. Those who resisted risked ruin. The end of the old empire showed how war could act like a blade through history, cutting away institutions that had seemed permanent. Napoleon's victories helped awaken modern German nationalism against him. At first, some German reformers admired parts of what French power brought. They saw new laws, administrative reform, and the weakening of old privileges. But occupation, demands for troops, taxes, and humiliation created resentment. The more Napoleon reorganized German lands for his own purposes, the more people began to imagine a shared German cause against foreign domination. Writers, students, soldiers, and reformers helped turn defeat into political feeling. Language, culture, and memory became tools of resistance. This did not mean modern Germany appeared all at once. The process was uneven and full of contradictions. Still, Napoleon unintentionally helped give his enemies a stronger sense of collective identity. His empire pressed diverse regions together through pressure and grievance. People who might once have identified mainly with a prince or city began thinking in broader terms. That is one of history's deeper ironies. A ruler who tried to master Europe hoped to awaken forces that would outlive his mastery. He placed relatives on thrones across Europe's conquered kingdoms. Napoleon wanted Europe organized around loyalty, and family seemed like the safest foundation. He made brothers, sisters, and in-laws into rulers over territories tied to his empire. At first glance, it looked like a brilliant way to secure control. A Bonaparte on the throne should, in theory, serve Bonaparte interests. But ruling a kingdom was not the same as obeying a family dinner conversation. Local elites had demands. Populations had grievances. Military needs drained resources. Some relatives tried to govern responsibly, which could bring them into conflict with Napoleon's relentless imperial priorities. Others lacked the talent or authority needed for the roles forced upon them. The family system revealed his need to reshape Europe into a dynastic network, even though he had risen through revolution. It also revealed his mistrust. He preferred blood ties because independent rulers might betray him. Yet blood did not solve the problem of legitimacy. A throne given by conquest remained fragile. Joseph Bonaparte became King of Spain during a disastrous occupation. Joseph had already been placed on a throne in Naples before Napoleon moved him to Spain. The decision proved catastrophic. Spain was not an empty square on the chessboard. It had its own monarchy, church, traditions, regional loyalties, and fierce local pride. Many Spaniards rejected Joseph as an imposed ruler, no matter what reforms he might promise. Napoleon expected political control to follow military success, but Spain resisted in ways that did not fit his usual pattern. Cities rose. Rural fighters attacked. Priests and local leaders fueled opposition. British intervention under Wellington turned the conflict into a sustained strategic drain. Joseph struggled to appear legitimate while depending on French arms. That contradiction haunted his reign. He could not rule freely, and he could not fully escape the shadow of his brother's decisions. The Spanish crown became less a prize than a trap. It showed that Napoleon could place a man on a throne, but he could not always make a nation accept him. Spain's guerrilla war drained French strength for years. The fighting in Spain became a different kind of nightmare from the grand battles Napoleon preferred. Small bands attacked convoys, couriers, patrols, and isolated units. Roads became dangerous. Messages could be delayed or captured. French soldiers found that holding cities did not mean controlling the countryside. Every village might hide information, anger, or a sudden ambush. This constant pressure forced France to keep large numbers of troops tied down in a theatre that produced no decisive triumph. It also wore away morale. Conventional victory was hard to define when the enemy could disappear after striking. The war became brutal and bitter, with violence against civilians and reprisals deepening hatred. For Napoleon, Spain was a wound that would not close. It consumed men, money, time, and attention, while other enemies watched for weakness. The conflict proved that an empire could be exhausted not only by losing great battles, but by bleeding through thousands of smaller cuts. The word guerrilla became famous during resistance to Napoleon's armies. The term means little war in Spanish, and it captured a style of fighting that frustrated the French deeply. It did not require an army to stand in neat lines against imperial troops. Instead, resistance could survive through mobility, local knowledge, and public support. Fighters chose when to appear and when to vanish. They knew roads, hills, hiding places, and sympathizers. A small victory might be the destruction of supplies or the capture of a messenger. Such actions could seem minor alone, but together they disrupted the machinery of occupation. The word spread because the phenomenon mattered. Europe saw that a population could resist beyond the defeat of its former army. This helped change how people thought about war. It was not only the business of kings, generals, and regular troops. Ordinary communities could become part of the conflict. The fame of the word reflects the shock of that realization. Napoleon's age helped name a modern kind of resistance. The Peninsular War showed that conquest could rot from within. At the beginning, French power in Iberia appeared formidable. Armies had crossed borders, royal authority had been broken, and a new ruler had been installed. Yet beneath that surface, the occupation corroded. The more troops Napoleon sent, the more resources were consumed. The harsher French control became, the more resistance intensified. British and Portuguese forces added a disciplined military challenge that made the conflict even harder to contain. The result was a war that damaged the empire from inside its own expansion. Napoleon later called it an ulcer, and the image fits because it drained strength steadily, rather than destroying him in one stroke. Spain and Portugal taught a lesson that conquerors often learn too late. Taking territory is not the same as governing it. Winning battles is not the same as gaining obedience. An empire can look vast on a map while becoming weaker at its edges. The Peninsular War made that danger painfully clear. Napoleon underestimated how fiercely people would defend their homelands. His system worked best when states could be defeated through armies, capitals, and treaties. But national feeling could make that formula fail. When people believed the struggle was about their land, faith, families, or independence, defeat became harder to impose. Spain revealed this with brutal clarity. Later, resistance elsewhere reinforced the lesson. Napoleon often judged political reality through rulers and military structures, yet loyalty could live below those levels. A village, a church community, a language, or a memory of insult could sustain defiance. This did not make resistance pure or simple. Popular wars could be violent and divided, but they changed the cost of conquest. An invader might beat a government and still face a country unwilling to become quiet. Napoleon inspired admiration among some, but foreign occupation created anger that reforms could not erase. He helped spread modern state power across Europe, but he also helped awaken the emotional force that would be used against him. The continental system tried to strangle Britain through trade. Because Britain was protected by sea power, Napoleon sought another way to break it. He tried to close European ports to British goods and damage the British economy by cutting off trade. The idea was ambitious and logical in theory. If Britain depended on commerce, then Europe could become a weapon by refusing its products. In practice, enforcement was extremely difficult. Smuggling flourished. Merchants suffered. Neutral trade created loopholes and disputes. Many Europeans resented being forced into an economic war that hurt their own livelihoods. Napoleon's system required obedience across a vast and uneven continent, which meant more pressure on allies and occupied territories. The policy also pulled him into conflicts with states that resisted its demands. It showed both the scale of his ambition and the limits of control. He could order ports closed, but he could not easily stop greed, necessity, geography, or the sea. Trade proved harder to conquer than capitals. Britain's navy kept fighting while Napoleon dominated the continent. On land, Napoleon could defeat coalition armies and force treaties. At sea, Britain remained stubbornly beyond his reach. The Royal Navy protected the British Isles, supported global trade, guarded colonies, and helped move money and supplies to allies. This created a strategic imbalance that haunted Napoleon's entire career. He could dominate much of Europe, but he could not make Britain accept defeat. British sea power also meant that wars against him could be renewed again and again. London could finance coalitions, support resistance, and wait for continental powers to recover. Napoleon called Britain a nation of shopkeepers as an insult, but commerce and naval strength gave it enormous resilience. The conflict became a duel between different kinds of power. France had the great army. Britain had the ships, credit, and patience to remain in the struggle. As long as the navy controlled the waters, Napoleon's victories on land could never feel completely final. Trafalgar destroyed French hopes of invading Britain by sea. The plan to invade Britain required control of the Channel, even briefly. That meant French and Allied fleets had to break the grip of the Royal Navy. The decisive naval battle came off Cape Trafalgar in 1805. Admiral Nelson led the British fleet in a daring attack that smashed the Franco-Spanish line. Nelson was killed, which gave the victory a tragic, heroic quality in Britain. But the strategic result was clear. Napoleon's invasion hopes were effectively finished. He would continue to fight Britain through economics and alliances, but the direct crossing became unrealistic. Trafalgar showed that his genius did not transfer easily to naval war. Ships required different traditions, training, command culture, and experience. France could build fleets, but it could not quickly create Nelson's navy. The defeat also freed Britain to keep pressuring the empire from the edges. Napoleon could march across Europe, but the narrow strip of water before Britain remained unconquered. Nelson defeated Napoleon's fleet without ever facing him on land. Horatio Nelson and Napoleon are often remembered as rivals, yet they never met in a battlefield duel. Their contest happened across strategy, distance, and the power of different domains. Nelson's victories struck at Napoleon's plans without requiring a face-to-face encounter. In Egypt, British naval success trapped the French expedition. At Trafalgar, British command of the sea became even more secure. Nelson's importance lies in what he denied Napoleon. He blocked the possibility that French land power could simply leap across water and settle the British problem by invasion. The admiral's style was bold, aggressive, and trusted by his captains. His victories became central to British national memory, just as Napoleon's battles became central to French imperial legend. Their contrast is fascinating. One man dominated roads, rivers, plains, and capitals. The other helped ensure that the sea remained hostile to him. Nelson's death made him a martyr, but his strategy lived on in Britain's survival. The invasion of Russia became a march into catastrophe. The campaign began with immense confidence and one of the largest armies Europe had ever seen. Napoleon expected pressure, maneuver, and perhaps a decisive battle that would force the Russian emperor to negotiate. Instead, the campaign stretched deeper into space than his system could comfortably endure. Russian forces retreated, supplies became harder to secure, and the distances swallowed energy. The army was not purely French. It included troops from many allied and subject states, which made cohesion harder as conditions worsened. Heat, hunger, disease, exhaustion, and poor supply began killing before winter became the famous villain of the story. Napoleon won battles, but he could not force the political result he needed quickly enough. Russia refused to behave like a defeated Central European state. The farther he advanced, the more dangerous victory became. The campaign revealed a terrifying truth. An army can move forward and still be losing, because geography itself can become an enemy. Moscow burned after Napoleon entered the city he expected to conquer. When Napoleon reached Moscow, he expected the occupation of the ancient city to carry immense political weight. Instead, he found a prize that would not deliver peace. Fires broke out and spread through large parts of the city, leaving French troops amid smoke, ruins, and uncertainty. The burning deprived the army of shelter and supplies at the very moment it needed both. More importantly, it destroyed the symbolic value Napoleon had sought. Entering Moscow did not force Tsar Alexander to surrender. No decisive message arrived. The city became a trap of expectation. Napoleon waited, hoping diplomacy would follow conquest, but the silence from the Russian court was devastating. Every day made the situation worse. The army had marched into a legendary city, yet it had gained no victory that could end the war. The scene is haunting because it reverses the usual meaning of conquest. Napoleon had taken Moscow, but Moscow gave him nothing he needed. Russian winter was deadly, but strategy destroyed the Grande Armée first. The frozen retreat became the most famous image of the campaign, yet the disaster had begun earlier. Russian strategy avoided giving Napoleon the quick decision he wanted. Retreating armies drew him deeper into the empire, while scorched supplies and stretched communications weakened his force. Disease spread. Horses died. Food became scarce. Discipline suffered. By the time severe cold arrived, the army was already damaged. Winter then intensified the ruin with shocking cruelty. Men froze on roads, weapons failed, and exhaustion became fatal. But it is misleading to imagine snow alone defeating Napoleon. The Russians used distance, denial, and persistence. They let the invasion lose shape before the climate finished the work. This matters because it shows that the catastrophe was not merely bad luck. It was a strategic failure rooted in assumptions about speed, negotiation, and endurance. Napoleon had mastered many European battlefields, but Russia forced him into a campaign where winning a battle could not solve the war. The retreat from Moscow became one of history's bleakest journeys. Once the army turned back, the campaign became a struggle for survival. The road was filled with hunger, cold, abandoned equipment, dead horses, broken wagons, and men who could no longer keep pace. Soldiers who had marched east with imperial confidence now moved west through a world collapsing around them. Units lost their shape. Friendships became lifelines. Discipline fought against desperation. Pursuing Russian forces added danger, but the greater enemy was the disintegration of the army itself. People burned furniture, tore cloth for warmth, and searched desperately for food. The retreat became a human tragedy on an enormous scale. It also became a moral shock to Europe. The force that had seemed unstoppable was reduced to fragments. Survivors carried stories that sounded almost beyond belief. For Napoleon's enemies, the sight of French weakness changed everything. For his supporters, it was a wound that no later victory could fully heal. The march back became the death of invincibility. Horses died in such numbers that cavalry power collapsed. Napoleon's army depended on horses far more than modern readers often realize. They pulled guns, carried officers, moved supplies, supported communication, and formed the cavalry that scouted and struck in battle. In Russia, the loss of horses became catastrophic. Many died from hunger, exhaustion, cold, and lack of proper fodder. Once they were gone, the army's mobility suffered terribly. Cannons had to be abandoned. Supply wagons could not move. Cavalry units shrank into shadows of themselves. Scouts became fewer, which meant less information. Without horses, an army of the age became slower, blinder, and weaker. The damage lasted beyond the retreat itself. Rebuilding cavalry took time because trained horses could not be replaced as easily as muskets. This loss helps explain why the Russian disaster affected later campaigns so deeply. It was not only men who vanished on the roads. The living engine that made Napoleonic warfare mobile died with them, one exhausted animal at a time. Napoleon's army crossed the Berezina River under desperate pressure. The crossing of the Berezina became one of the most dramatic episodes of the retreat. The army needed to escape across the river while Russian forces threatened from multiple directions. Panic could have destroyed everything. Engineers built bridges in freezing conditions, working in icy water with extraordinary courage. Soldiers, civilians, wagons, and remnants of units crowded toward the crossing points. Confusion and terror spread as people fought for survival. Yet the operation also showed that the army still possessed skill and discipline amid disaster. Key French commanders held off Russian attacks long enough for many to cross. The losses were terrible, especially among stragglers and non-combatants, but complete annihilation was avoided. That is why the Berezina carries a strange dual meaning. It was a scene of horror, but also an escape. Napoleon's enemies had a chance to trap him utterly. They failed to finish the destruction. The river became a symbol of both ruin and stubborn survival. The Russian disaster shattered the illusion that he was unbeatable. Before 1812, many Europeans had seen Napoleon as almost a force of nature. He had suffered setbacks, but his ability to recover and dominate seemed extraordinary. Russia changed that perception. The scale of the losses was too vast to hide. Veterans were gone. Horses were gone. Equipment was gone. Allied states began to reconsider their fear. Enemies who had waited for a crack now saw one open. The psychological effect mattered as much as the military damage. Power often depends on the belief that resistance is hopeless. Once that belief weakens, diplomacy changes, coalitions form, and hesitant rulers become bolder. Napoleon remained dangerous after Russia, but he no longer seemed inevitable. His enemies could imagine victory in a way they had not fully dared before. The campaign also damaged the loyalty of subject peoples who had paid for his ambition with their sons. The myth of invincibility had marched east with the army. It did not return intact. European powers joined together after sensing his empire had weakened. The coalition that formed after Russia did not arise from sudden friendship among Napoleon's enemies. These powers had their own rivalries, fears, and ambitions. What changed was their calculation. For years, many had made peace after defeat, because the cost of continued resistance seemed too high. After the Russian catastrophe, the balance looked different. Prussia rose again. Russia pushed westward. Austria weighed its options and eventually joined the struggle against him. Britain continued to supply money and pressure. The alliance was held together by necessity. Each power understood that Napoleon might recover if given time. They also understood that defeating him required persistence beyond a single battle. This cooperation was one of the great achievements of his opponents. They learned not to be divided as easily as before. The empire faced a Europe that had absorbed hard lessons. Fear remained, but it no longer paralyzed. The wounded giant was still formidable, yet now the hunters were gathering. Leipzig became the battle of nations against Napoleon's fading power. The battle near Leipzig in 1813 was enormous in scale and symbolism. Armies from several powers converged against Napoleon in a struggle that showed how much the war had changed. This was no isolated duel between two states. It was a continental reckoning. Napoleon fought with skill, and his troops showed their old courage, but numbers and pressure told against him. Former allies had turned. German forces were increasingly unreliable or openly opposed. The battlefield became a sign that his empire's structure was cracking. After days of fighting, the French retreat turned disastrous when a bridge was destroyed too early, trapping many soldiers. The defeat forced Napoleon back toward France and shattered his grip on Germany. Leipzig mattered because it gathered the consequences of the previous decade into one vast collision. The nations he had dominated now stood together against him. The battle did not end his career, but it made the final defense of his empire unavoidable. He abdicated after allies entered Paris in triumph. Paris had been the heart of his authority, and its fall carried a final political weight, but no battlefield argument could erase. In 1814, Allied armies entered the city after a campaign fought on French soil. Napoleon had shown flashes of his old brilliance during that defense, winning sharp actions against separate enemy forces. But the numbers were against him, and the political foundation beneath him was weakening. Marshals who had followed him for years no longer believed continued resistance could save the empire. They pressed him to abdicate. For a man who had built his life around willpower, the moment was devastating. He tried to secure the succession for his son, but the Allies would not accept a simple continuation of the dynasty. His departure marked the collapse of the imperial system he had constructed so rapidly. The ruler who had once dictated terms to Europe now faced terms imposed upon him. Power had completed its turn. Elba gave Napoleon a tiny island kingdom after empire. The arrangement was strange enough to feel almost unreal. After ruling much of Europe, Napoleon was sent to a small Mediterranean island and allowed to keep the title of emperor. He did not become a forgotten prisoner at first. He became the ruler of a reduced world with a miniature court, a small army, and real administrative duties. Elba had mines, ports, roads, villages, and people whose daily lives now fell under his restless attention. He inspected defenses, planned improvements, reorganized local finances, and behaved as if scale were almost irrelevant. A man who had commanded vast armies now studied island details with the same hunger for control. Visitors watched him closely, unsure whether he was finished or merely waiting. The absurdity of the situation was part of its danger. Europe had tried to make him small without making him powerless. Elba became a pause between two storms, and Napoleon treated even that tiny stage as a place for command. His return from Elba became one of history's boldest comebacks. The gamble began with secrecy, nerve, and a breathtaking sense of timing. Napoleon knew the restored Bourbon monarchy had failed to win deep affection from many soldiers and citizens. He also knew that the great powers were distracted by negotiations and rivalries after his fall. So he left Elba with a small force and landed in southern France. Everything depended on momentum. If the country rejected him, he could be captured quickly. If the army rallied, the impossible might happen. His route north became a political drama played out mile by mile. Officials hesitated. Soldiers listened. Crowds gathered. The restored king's authority began to look brittle. Napoleon did not return with a huge army. He returned with a name that still carried electricity. That was the astonishing part. He turned memory into movement. His comeback showed that political power is not only held in palaces. Sometimes it waits inside loyalty, resentment, and one audacious step onto shore. Soldiers sent to arrest him joined him instead. The scene became one of the most famous moments of his return. Troops loyal to the restored monarchy were ordered to stop him, and a confrontation seemed inevitable. Napoleon approached them directly. Rather than hide behind his escort, he exposed himself and appealed to their old attachment. He reportedly invited any man who wished to kill his emperor to fire. It was theatrical, dangerous, and perfectly suited to the moment. The soldiers did not shoot. Many shifted their loyalty to him. Whether later accounts polished every detail or not, the meaning is clear. Bourbon authority could issue orders, but Napoleon could still command emotion. This was the power of shared campaigns, old victories, and personal legend. The army had not forgotten him as quickly as politicians hoped. The moment revealed a truth that frightened Europe. A defeated ruler could still be more real to soldiers than the government that had replaced him. The 100 Days proved his charisma still frightened Europe. The period after his return was brief, but it shook the continent. Governments that had been discussing the future of Europe suddenly faced the return of the man they believed removed from history. Napoleon tried to present himself as more liberal and restrained than before. He needed support inside France and time to rebuild his position. But foreign powers did not trust the transformation. To them, his presence alone meant war would return. The speed of the reaction shows how deeply he unsettled them. Armies were mobilized, alliances hardened, and negotiation gave way to military preparation. Inside France, enthusiasm mixed with uncertainty. Some welcomed him as a national hero. Others feared renewed invasion and conscription. That tension made the episode dramatic. It was not simply a comeback. It was a test of whether personal magnetism could overcome political exhaustion. For a short span, Napoleon seemed to bend events again. Then Europe moved to break the spell permanently. Waterloo turned on timing, mud, courage, and confusion. The final battle was shaped by more than grand strategy. Rain had soaked the ground, making it harder for artillery to move and cavalry to charge effectively. Napoleon delayed the main attack, partly because he wanted the field to dry. That delay mattered because Prussian forces were marching toward the battlefield. Wellington's army stood on a defensive ridge and absorbed repeated assaults with stubborn discipline. French attacks struck hard, but coordination faltered. Cavalry charges went forward without the infantry and artillery support needed to break the Allied line completely. Farm complexes became fierce strongpoints, drawing in men and time. Commands moved through smoke, noise, and misunderstanding. At moments, victory still seemed possible. That is what makes Waterloo so compelling. It was not a simple collapse from the beginning. It was a battle where small delays, hard ground, human courage, and imperfect information gathered into a final result. By evening, Napoleon's last chance had narrowed beyond recovery. Grouchy's absence became one of Waterloo's great debates. Marshal Grouchy had been sent to pursue the Prussians after earlier fighting, and his role has been argued over ever since. The central question is haunting. Could he have reached the main battlefield in time to change the outcome? Some critics blame him for not marching toward the sound of the guns. Others argue that his orders, distance, muddy roads, and uncertainty made the situation far more complicated. He did engage Prussian forces elsewhere, but he did not prevent Blücher from joining Wellington at the decisive moment. The controversy matters because Waterloo has always invited the search for turning points. People want to know whether an empire fell because of one decision, one road, or one marshal's interpretation. History rarely works so neatly. Grouchy's absence did not alone decide everything, but it became a symbol of missed connection. In a campaign where hours mattered, an army separated from its emperor became a question that never stopped echoing. The Old Guard's final advance broke Napoleon's last hope. The Imperial Guard carried an almost sacred aura within the French army. These veterans represented discipline, prestige, and the memory of earlier victories. Napoleon had often held them back as a final reserve, which made their commitment at Waterloo deeply dramatic. When elements of the Guard advanced late in the day, French soldiers understood that the decisive moment had arrived. If they broke Wellington's line, the battle might still be rescued, but the Allied defense held. Fire struck the advancing columns. Confusion spread. Then the Guard recoiled, and the psychological effect was devastating. For years, many believed these men did not fail. Seeing them thrown back shattered confidence across the French army. Panic moved faster than orders. The cry that the Guard was retreating carried a terrible meaning. It suggested that the last symbol of Napoleonic certainty had been broken. The battle was not only lost in military terms, it was lost in the imagination of the men who had followed him. After Waterloo, he surrendered to the British instead of fleeing. Napoleon still had options after the defeat, but none were good. He considered escape to America, where he might have lived beyond the reach of European politics. British naval control made that dream dangerous. Staying in France risked capture by enemies who might treat him more harshly. In the end, he placed himself in British hands, hoping they would behave with a certain honor toward a fallen ruler. He boarded a British ship and imagined, perhaps, that he might find a dignified exile. The decision shows a rare moment when his instinct for bold escape met the hard limits of reality. The British did not send him to a pleasant estate. They chose a remote island from which return would be nearly impossible. His surrender therefore became the doorway to his final confinement. It was a last act of calculation, but this time the calculation did not bend events in his favor. Europe had learned not to leave him near the stage. Saint Helena was chosen because escape seemed nearly impossible. The island sat far out in the South Atlantic, isolated by ocean and guarded by British authority. That was exactly why it suited the victors. Elba had been too close, too porous, and too vulnerable to Napoleon's restless will. This time, they wanted distance itself to become a prison war. St. Helena was rugged, windswept, and difficult to reach. Ships could be monitored. Visitors could be controlled. Communication with Europe was slow. The choice reveals how seriously Britain and its allies still feared him. He had no army. He had no throne. Yet they believed his mere presence near Europe could unsettle politics again. On St. Helena, geography became strategy. The island was meant to silence the possibility of another return. For Napoleon, the punishment was psychological as well as physical. A man who had lived by movement found himself trapped in remoteness. The world he once tried to command continued without him, beyond a horizon he could not cross. His final exile unfolded on a remote island in the Atlantic. Life there was a strange mixture of routine, frustration, memory, and slow decline. Napoleon lived at Longwood House, which he considered damp and uncomfortable. He walked, read, dictated, argued with British officials, received visitors under restrictions, and replayed the great events of his life. The island's climate and isolation weighed heavily on him. Around him gathered a small household of loyal companions, but even loyalty could not recreate power. Days that had once been filled with dispatches from armies were now filled with conversations, grievances, and recollection. He watched his health worsen and his world shrink. Yet exile did not make him passive. He fought over status, protocol, and narrative. He insisted on being treated as an emperor, not merely a prisoner. That insistence mattered because identity was one of the last territories he could defend. Saint Helena became the final theater of his life, not a battlefield, but a place where memory itself was contested. Napoleon spent his last years shaping how history would remember him. He understood that reputation could survive where power could not. During his final exile, he dictated accounts that presented his career in the best possible light. He framed himself as a defender of revolutionary principles, a modern lawgiver, and a victim of hostile monarchies. He explained defeats, justified decisions, and placed his actions inside a grand historical design. This was not casual reminiscing. It was a campaign of memory. He knew future generations would judge him, and he wanted to brief the jury before his enemies did. His companions helped record and circulate these ideas, turning exile into a workshop of legend. The result was powerful. Later readers encountered not only the defeated emperor, but Napoleon as he wished to be understood. Of course, his version was selective. All memoirs are. Yet its influence was enormous because it gave admirers a script. Even after losing his empire, he continued to command part of the story. He dictated memories that defended his choices and magnified his legend. The recollections produced around him were full of strategy, blame, explanation, and self-portrait. He revisited campaigns with the eye of someone still trying to win them after the fact. He praised loyal servants, criticized hesitant allies, and turned enemies into obstacles placed by fate or envy. He often presented his rule as rational, necessary, and misunderstood. This matters because memory is never neutral when spoken by a fallen ruler. Napoleon's words shaped how supporters interpreted his rise and collapse. They also gave later historians material to examine, challenge, and compare. The act of dictation itself is revealing. He had spent years issuing orders that moved armies. Now he issued sentences that moved opinion. The battlefield had changed from Europe to posterity. His voice, filtered through companions and publication, traveled farther than he could. In those final years, the empire of territory was gone. The empire of explanation was still being built, line by line. His death on Saint Helena still inspires arguments and theories. Napoleon died in 1821, far from France and surrounded by suspicion. Officially, stomach cancer was a central explanation, and the disease had family history behind it. Yet rumors of poisoning grew, especially because traces of arsenic were later discussed in connection with preserved hair samples. The debate became part of the wider fascination with his end. Was he killed by illness, environment, medical treatment, deliberate poisoning, or some combination of factors? Modern analysis has tended to support natural disease more strongly than murder, but the mystery never fully vanished from popular imagination. That persistence says as much about Napoleon's legend as about medicine. Ordinary deaths rarely satisfy when the life has been extraordinary. People expect a final secret to match the scale of the man. His last illness unfolded in confinement, with political enemies controlling his surroundings. That alone encouraged suspicion. Even his death became a battlefield where evidence, loyalty, and myth struggled for control. Napoleon's body was returned to Paris nearly 20 years later. The return of his remains in 1840 was a carefully staged national event. France had changed since his fall, yet the memory of his glory still carried enormous force. Bringing him home allowed the government of the time to borrow that force while controlling it through ceremony. The voyage from Saint Helena transformed a dead exile into a returning figure of national history. Crowds gathered in Paris to witness the funeral procession. The event was solemn, political, and emotional at once. Many who had never served him still felt the pull of the legend. Veterans could remember youth, victory, and loss. Critics could see the danger of romanticizing conquest. The return did not restore the empire, but it restored Napoleon to the symbolic center of France. A body that had been kept at the edge of the world was placed back inside the capital's memory. The exile ended in death, but the public drama resumed. Les Invalides became the grand resting place of his remains. His tomb in Paris was designed to carry weight, not modesty. Les Invalides already had deep military meaning as a place connected to veterans and royal military tradition. Placing Napoleon there tied him to the history of French arms in a permanent way. The setting encourages visitors to approach with a sense of scale. The dome, the open space, and the solemn architecture turn the tomb into a national monument rather than a simple grave. This is important because burial sites can shape memory as powerfully as books. A tomb tells people how important the dead are supposed to feel. Napoleon's resting place presents him as a figure who belongs to the destiny of France, even though his career divided the nation and devastated much of Europe. The grandeur does not settle the moral argument. It heightens it. Visitors stand before the remains of a man who was at once a ruler, reformer, conqueror, prisoner, and myth. His tomb was designed to make visitors look downward in awe. The arrangement creates a subtle physical drama. Visitors often view the sarcophagus from an upper level, looking down into the open circular space below. To see it closely, they descend, which changes the body's posture and the mind's mood. The design makes the viewer participate in the act of reverence. It also produces a strange paradox. You look down at the tomb, yet the scale of the setting makes the figure seem elevated. This kind of architectural storytelling suits Napoleon perfectly. His life was full of staged meanings, careful images, and controlled impressions. Even in death, the space around him guides emotion. The sarcophagus is massive, polished, and placed with theatrical clarity. It does not ask visitors to remember an ordinary life. It asks them to confront magnitude. Whether someone admires him or distrusts him, the tomb makes indifference difficult. Stone, space, and silence combine to say that history has weight, and this man left a heavy one. Josephine never became mother to the heir Napoleon wanted. This fact shaped the private sorrow behind imperial politics. Josephine had children from her first marriage, and Napoleon cared for her family in important ways. But she did not give him a direct heir. As his power expanded, the question became more than personal. A dynasty needed succession. Without a son recognized as his own legitimate heir, the empire looked less secure. Love, affection, and habit struggled against political calculation. Josephine understood the danger. Napoleon did too. Their marriage had survived passion, jealousy, separations, and public pressure, but it could not easily survive the demand for dynastic continuity. The tragedy lies in the collision between feeling and statecraft. A ruler who had reorganized kingdoms could not command biology. The absence of an heir became a force inside the marriage, silent at times and overwhelming at others. It turned private disappointment into national concern. In the imperial world Napoleon built, even intimacy had to answer to the future of power. He divorced Josephine while still keeping deep affection for her. The separation was political, but it was not emotionally empty. Napoleon needed a legitimate heir, and Josephine could not provide one. That made divorce the brutal solution. The ceremony of separation was public and painful, shaped by imperial necessity rather than simple rejection. Both understood what was happening, yet understanding did not remove the hurt. Napoleon continued to show concern for Josephine afterward, and she remained an important figure in his emotional life. This makes the episode more compelling than a cold dynastic calculation alone. It shows the cost of turning a personal life into a political instrument. He had risen through will, strategy, and command, but here he faced a situation where victory meant loss. Josephine retained dignity and status, but the marriage was over. Napoleon moved on to seek a dynastic future, while the memory of the first empress lingered. Their bond survived in altered form, proving that power can sever a relationship without erasing attachment. Marie Louise gave Napoleon the son he desperately desired. The marriage to the Austrian Archduchess was meant to secure more than a child. It connected Napoleon to one of Europe's oldest dynasties, giving his empire a kind of legitimacy that battlefield success alone could not provide. When Marie Louise gave birth to a son, the event seemed to answer the great dynastic question. Cannons announced the birth, and the empire celebrated. For Napoleon, this was personal triumph and political insurance joined together. The child represented continuity. He suggested that the Bonaparte dynasty might survive beyond the founder's life. Yet the joy carried irony. The alliance with Austria would not save him permanently. The son's future would be shaped by forces beyond Napoleon's control. Still, in that moment, the emperor had what he had sought with such intensity. A boy had been born into a world of ceremony, expectation, and danger. The cradle stood near the summit of power, but the ground beneath the empire was already less secure than it appeared. His son was called the King of Rome at birth. The title was chosen to proclaim imperial grandeur from the first breath of life. It linked the child to Rome, empire, and historical continuity. This was not a casual name. It was a message to France and Europe that Napoleon's dynasty had a future. The baby became a symbol before he could speak. Artists, officials, and courtiers treated him as the promise of stability. For Napoleon, the title also carried emotional weight. He had built an empire through risk and force, and now he could imagine it passing to his own blood. Yet the child's life would not match the scale of the title. After Napoleon's fall, he was raised largely within the Austrian world of his mother's family. His connection to the French imperial dream became more symbolic than practical. That contrast makes the title poignant. A baby was announced as King of Rome, but history had already begun moving toward exile, separation, and unrealized inheritance. Napoleon's siblings often struggled beneath the weight of his ambition. Being related to him could bring crowns, wealth, and status, but it also brought impossible expectations. Napoleon saw family as an extension of policy. He wanted his brothers and sisters to support the imperial system, obey strategic needs, and represent Bonaparte authority across Europe. Yet they had their own personalities, desires, and limits. Some resented being treated as instruments. Some tried to balance local interests with imperial demands. Others disappointed him by lacking the discipline or political skill he expected. The family drama was therefore more than gossip. It exposed a flaw in his system. Blood ties did not automatically produce competence or obedience. A brother made king still had to govern real people. A sister placed in high society still had ambitions of her own. Napoleon could command armies more easily than relatives. His family rose because of him, but they also lived under the pressure of his vast designs. The Bonaparte name was a gift and a burden. His mother, Letizia, remained cautious about fortune and power. Letizia Bonaparte had lived through insecurity long before her son became emperor. She raised a large family through political upheaval, limited resources, and changing loyalties. That experience made her wary of sudden greatness. While others were dazzled by titles and ceremonies, she kept a hard sense that fortune can turn. Her caution seems almost prophetic when seen against the rise and fall of the empire. She did not always play the glittering role expected of an emperor's mother. Instead, she embodied an older realism rooted in survival. This makes her one of the most interesting figures in the family story. Napoleon chased scale, glory, and control. Letizia remembered fragility. She had seen enough instability to distrust splendor that arrived too quickly. Her attitude offers a human counterpoint to imperial spectacle. Behind the coronations and thrones stood a mother who knew that power could vanish and that a family might one day need what it had saved. Talleyrand served Napoleon brilliantly, then quietly helped undermine him. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand was one of the most skilled political survivors of his age. He had served monarchy, revolution, empire, and restoration with extraordinary adaptability. Under Napoleon, he helped manage diplomacy and understood European power with rare sophistication. Yet he also became increasingly doubtful about the emperor's endless appetite for domination. Talleyrand preferred balance, negotiation, and durable settlements. Napoleon often preferred pressure backed by victory. Their relationship became a contest between calculation and will. Talleyrand could be useful, charming, cynical, and treacherous. He knew when a regime was becoming dangerous to itself. Eventually, he worked against Napoleon's interests while preserving his own future. This makes him fascinating because he was not a battlefield opponent. He was an insider who understood the empire's weaknesses from within. Napoleon commanded through intensity. Talleyrand survived through distance. In the end, the diplomat's cold patience proved powerful. He helped shape what came after the man he had once served. Fauchet survived by mastering secrets in a dangerous age. Joseph Fauchet was a different kind of power broker. He understood surveillance, fear, information, and timing. As Minister of Police, he watched networks of loyalty and dissent with unsettling skill. He had already passed through the violent phases of the revolution, which taught him how quickly political winds could change. Under Napoleon, he became useful because every strong regime wants to know what people are saying when they think no one important is listening. Fauchet gathered reports, tracked conspiracies, and sensed danger in salons, streets, and offices. If he was never merely a servant, he protected himself by knowing too much and committing too little. Napoleon distrusted him, but also found him hard to discard. That tension made Fauchet one of the empire's most shadowy figures. He represents the hidden machinery beneath public glory. Battles might fill paintings, but secret policing helped regimes endure. In a dangerous age, information could be as sharp as any sword. Napoleon restored slavery in French colonies after revolutionary abolition. This decision remains one of the darkest parts of his rule. During the Revolution, France had abolished slavery in its colonies, a radical act with enormous moral significance. Napoleon later reversed that policy in places where French control made restoration possible. The decision was tied to colonial wealth, plantation interests, racial hierarchy, and imperial ambition. Its consequences were brutal for enslaved people and for those who had fought to secure freedom. In Saint-Domingue, where formerly enslaved people had already transformed the political reality, French attempts to reassert control met fierce resistance. The struggle eventually led to Haitian independence, one of the most important events in Atlantic history. This subject complicates any simple portrait of Napoleon as a carrier of liberty. He preserved some revolutionary reforms in Europe, But in the colonial world, he could act in direct opposition to freedom. To understand him honestly, one must hold both truths together. His modernizing vision had severe moral limits. His rule expanded rights for some while limiting freedoms for others. Napoleon's legacy is difficult because it refuses to sit neatly in one category. He helped secure equality before the law for many men, ended certain feudal privileges, promoted careers based on talent, and strengthened a rational state. For people tired of aristocratic barriers, these changes mattered. Yet his system also restricted political liberty, censored opposition, subordinated women in family law, and demanded obedience from conquered peoples. This combination is why debates about him continue. He could appear as a son of the revolution and an enemy of its democratic spirit at the same time. His reforms often made society more orderly and legally consistent, but order came with surveillance and control. He believed deeply in ability, but not in uncontrolled public dissent. He valued law, but preferred law under a strong ruler. The result was a legacy full of tension. Napoleon expanded the modern state's promise while revealing how easily that state could become authoritarian. Women lost important legal independence under his civil code. The civil code is often praised for clarity and equality among male citizens, but its treatment of women reflected a restrictive social order. Married women faced strong legal authority from husbands. Their ability to control property, sign contracts, seek divorce, and act independently was limited in significant ways. The family was treated as a hierarchy, with the father placed firmly at the head. This mattered because law shapes daily life. It determines who can decide, own, leave, inherit, and be heard. For women, the code could narrow possibilities even as it rationalized the legal system for the nation as a whole. The contradiction is central to Napoleon's domestic legacy. A reform that looked modern in some respects reinforced older forms of male power in others. It helped build a stable civil order, but that stability rested on inequality inside the household. The code's influence spread widely, which meant these assumptions traveled too. Legal order came with a gendered cost. Napoleon censored newspapers while presenting himself as reason's champion. He valued intelligence, science, administration, and rational law, but he did not welcome a free press, but could challenge his authority. Newspapers were monitored, reduced in number, and pressured to serve the needs of the regime. Public opinion mattered to him too much to leave it alone. He understood that criticism could weaken confidence, encourage enemies, and complicate war. So he shaped information with the same seriousness that he shaped military plans. This creates another revealing contradiction. Napoleon wanted to be seen as a modern ruler guided by reason, merit, and public order. Yet reason, in his system, was expected to operate within boundaries he controlled. Debate could exist only so far as it did not threaten power. The press became less a free arena than a managed instrument. This did not make him unique among rulers, but it does challenge any simple image of enlightened leadership. He respected thought, but he feared uncontrolled voices. His wars redrew borders and scattered revolutionary ideas across Europe. The armies that marched under Napoleon changed more than maps. They carried legal reforms, administrative models, secular authority, and the shock of merit challenging birth. In many places, old structures were weakened or swept aside. Some people welcomed aspects of these changes, especially where feudal burdens or rigid privileges had long survived. Others experienced them as foreign domination, backed by conscription and taxation. That double effect made the Napoleonic period explosive. Ideas spread through conquest, but resentment spread with them. Borders shifted, states vanished, new kingdoms appeared, and old powers were forced to reform. Even after his defeat, Europe could not simply return to what it had been. The memory of change had entered political life. People had seen that institutions could be remade quickly. They had also seen the cost when reform traveled with armies. Napoleon's wars became engines of transformation and trauma. They scattered seeds that would grow in ways he could not control. Napoleon's legend survived because he was both builder and destroyer. Few lives contained such powerful contradictions. He created institutions that endured, yet he consumed lives on a vast scale. He rewarded talent, yet concentrated authority around himself. He carried parts of the revolution across Europe, yet crowned himself emperor. He inspired devotion among soldiers, fear among rulers, anger among occupied peoples, and fascination in generations born long after him. That is why he remains impossible to reduce to a single lesson. If he had only conquered, he might be remembered as another ambitious warlord. If he had only reformed, he might belong mainly to legal history. Instead, he did both with extraordinary force. He left behind codes, monuments, myths, borders, graves, arguments, and questions that still feel alive. His story draws people in because it asks what greatness costs. It asks whether order can excuse domination. It asks how one person can reshape an age and still fail to master the future. That unresolved tension is the core of his immortality. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the life of Napoleon. We have followed a young outsider from Corsica as he stepped into a France transformed by revolution. We have seen him rise through artillery, ambition, and astonishing nerve. We have watched him become a ruler who could reorganize a nation, reshape laws, inspire soldiers, frighten monarchs, and send whole armies moving across the map of Europe. His story carried us from the heat of Egypt to the roads of Italy, from the ceremonies of empire to the lonely distance of Saint Helena. We saw brilliance, calculation, loyalty, cruelty, reform, and ruin. And through it all, one question remained close behind him. How can one life leave such a deep mark on the world and still remain so difficult to fully understand? Now, as the facts begin to settle, let the sharp edges of history soften a little. Let the marching columns fade into the distance. Let the old maps fold closed. Let the cannon smoke drift away from the fields, until all that remains is the stillness after a long story has been told. If you enjoyed this sleepy journey through history, you're warmly invited to like, subscribe, or leave a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. And if you happen to still be awake, there will be another video waiting on the screen, ready to carry you into a new corner of the past. But for now, there is nothing more you need to follow. Let your shoulders rest. Let your breathing slow. Let the day loosen its hold, one breath at a time. History can wait until morning. Sleep well, and good night.